Well, I can tell you who I was. That's probably more interesting. I was an academic not so long ago. In fact, most recently I was a professor. Professor, yeah, of Japanese language and culture. Not so much language, I mostly taught literature and media classes, which is, I suppose, why we're here. Anyway, I had come to the university that I was working at basically on what was technically a short-term contract. Although at every point along the way in which I was interviewing, in fact it was a very excruciating interview for this one-year contract, every point along the way it was emphasized over and over and over and over again how it's like, oh, well, we're going to be turning this into a permanent position. We will be taking you on, young Padawan. And, you know, I believe them, because generally when someone tells me that something is the case, I tend to, you know, believe them. As it turns out, they were, what's the word I'm looking for? Lying bastards. They didn't really have any intention of keeping me on permanently. In fact, they hired someone from an Ivy League university, where, as we know, all of the smart people come from. And my former department is now, I guess, reveling in the glory that is his complete lack of knowledge about anything. Anyway, so while I was a professor, as I said, I taught culture classes, literature classes, but I also taught classes on manga. And in fact, comics, manga, and especially comparative studies thereof, to use a bit of legalese. It's one of my, I guess you could say, scholarly roles, like dinner roles, I don't know. It's something I do. I sit down at a computer. In fact, no, that's actually a total lie. I don't sit down at a computer. I sit down in front of a piece of paper. You may have heard of paper. Your ancestors used it to wipe their asses. No, I sit down at a piece of paper, you know, and I write things out. Sometimes they're smart, but usually it's just stupid. But I get a chance then to go back later and look over it and sort of revise it and make sure that it's, well, less stupid. And then once it's reached sort of its peak, less stupidity, send it off to journals and to editors who are, you know, putting together volumes of essays that no one is ever going to read, let's be frank. And they decide whether or not you get to be printed in their completely pointless publication. And that's pretty much how academia works. I mean, there's some teaching and administrative stuff and a bunch of other, like, you know, goat slaughter and so forth, but for the most part, scholarship, that's how it works. You write something, you make it suck slightly less, you send it off, someone tells you that it's shit, you cry, you slit your wrists, but eventually, you know, you bandage your wrists up, and you take another look at this piece of shit that you wrote, and you decide that, well, maybe it's not so bad. I'm gonna look at me. Okay, so there's the camera that's right here, and then there's a guy who's right here. He looks surprisingly like me, although I'm not sure. And I'm gonna look at him. So if you're turned off by the fact that I'm not looking at this thing and then I'm looking at this thing, well, fuck you. I'm flipping off somebody over here, apparently. Whatever. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, academia. So that's how academia works. And so, in my time as an academic, I have managed to occasionally publish things on or about manga and comics, generally speaking. Because I was trained as a comparativist, is the technical term. I did a PhD in comparative literature. I did a PhD in comparative literature. On poetry of all things, yeah. Yeah. I thought I was going to be a scholar of poetry. In fact, I still kind of am. Though everything that I've ever published is about comics or manga. Let's just say comics. It's really the same thing. Same thing. No, comics and manga are completely different things, aren't they? Well, no. Well, we'll get to that. So I was not hired on permanently for my own job. Yes, I lost my own job. In fact, an easier version of my own job. The job I had at the time was actually harder than the job than the position they replaced it with. So yeah, I lost that, and now I'm just kind of floating around in the murk and the mire. And so I got the idea in my head that perhaps academia is not necessarily the place for that sort of research, that sort of scholarly practice.